Now, as you've probably already heard, the first official details have been announced by Jon Favreau in regards to his live-action Star Wars show, and what we've learned is that the show will be called The Mandalorian, and as has been rumored for some time now, it will take place shortly after the events of Return of the Jedi, and well before the events of the sequel trilogy, and will follow a lone gunman as he travels through the outer reaches of the galaxy, and far away from the law of the New Republic. And personally, I think this sounds like it has a ton of potential to be fantastic, and an all-around winning combination that gives me a lot of hope for the immediate future of the franchise. I mean, you've got a show about Mandalorians, something most fans have always wanted more of, being brought to us by Jon Favreau, who of course voiced one of the best Mandalorians we've gotten thus far in the new canon, that being Pre Vizsla in the Clone Wars. Not to mention, he's also the guy who directed the first Iron Man movie, a movie that took a little-known Marvel superhero, outside of the comic book fandom of course, and turned him into a household name, and is arguably the movie that really paved the way for what the MCU has now become. Furthermore, this announcement comes with the news that Dave Filoni will be directing the first episode of the show, and I truly think this will be the first step into a much larger world for this guy, a much deserved step. Because as fantastic of a job as he's done with Star Wars animation, it's time for him to move on to much larger projects, including perhaps even directing a movie or two someday down the road. Or perhaps he's being groomed for something much bigger, and will eventually be put at the head of story development for the whole damn franchise, and will become to Star Wars what Kevin Feige is to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Filoni is, after all, loved and respected by most fans. Not to mention, he was essentially a Padawan to George Lucas for several years during the creation of the Clone Wars animated show. He's about the closest thing there is to a George Lucas disciple, and an announcement of a broader role for him with the company could bring some fans back into the fold who have left or maybe are leaving the franchise because they've been unhappy with the direction of it or decisions made as of late. Though I do think this announcement alone will get the attention of some of the more disgruntled fans, because I think it's very likely the show will be aimed at a more adult crowd, and will probably be about the closest thing to an R-rated Star Wars we'll ever get. And I also think it's no coincidence that this announcement comes just days before Star Wars Resistance will premiere, and will likely be met by negativity, if not hostility, by some fans who will not like the newest iteration of Star Wars animation, and will see this as a downgrade from the show Rebels, which many saw as a downgrade from the show The Clone Wars before it. And yes, The Clone Wars is coming back for a 7th and final season, and that is great welcoming news and has a lot of fans excited. But the reason why so many fans are upset about Resistance, and as this poll I did suggests many won't even bother watching, isn't just because it's a show that seems to be aimed squarely at kids, but rather because there has been a track record or a precedence with The Clone Wars and the Rebels before it for Star Wars animation to have a broader appeal. Sure, on the surface, both Rebels and the Clone Wars may have seemed like straight-up kids' shows, and at times they did feel like that, especially early on in both their runs, and I'm looking at you, May Luron episode in Rebels, but there was also plenty for adult fans to enjoy in both those shows as well. In fact, both shows seemed to grow and mature with their audience, especially the Clone Wars, which by the last few seasons felt nothing like a kids' show anymore, and, as I've said before, is some of the best Star Wars we've ever gotten in any format. Which again is why fans are upset right now, because they know what can be done with Star Wars animation. And of course there is every chance Resistance will grow with its audience as well. It's just, and again this is based only off a couple trailers that we've gotten so far, it seems like the bar is starting even lower in terms of the maturity level of this show. Then again, Rebels also felt very immature at the start. I again point at that May Luron episode. But around midway through the first season, things started to change already. And that change happened when Tarkin showed up and had the Grand Inquisitor behead those two buffoon Imperial officers, which literally and figuratively seemed to indicate a changing of the guard for the show. And maybe I'm crazy or just a conspiracy theorist, but it almost seems like maybe Dave Filoni and company made those first few episodes of Rebels very, very kid-friendly on purpose, and then showed them to Disney and got the stamp of approval, and from that point on kept seeing how far they could push the show or what they could get away with. And I'm still stunned they got away with decapitation in a show on Disney XD. Though of course it wasn't shown, it was instead very, very heavily implied. And if you don't think that's what happened in that moment, then you probably also don't think Anakin slaughtered a room full of kids in Revenge of the Sith. And look, I don't want to pass any sort of final judgment on Resistance before I've even seen one episode, nor do I want to make The Mandalorian out to be some type of potential savior of the franchise based on one picture and a very vague synopsis. Though again, I do have high hopes that it'll be the type of show some fans have always wanted out of Star Wars. Just like I have fear that Resistance could officially be the end of Star Wars animation with any sort of broad appeal. Then again, I could be wrong on both fronts, and maybe The Mandalorian won't be as adult as I assume it will be, just like maybe Resistance won't be quite as childish. At least, it won't stay that way for long, perhaps. After all, we've learned that the first season will overlap with the events of The Force Awakens, and it's hard to imagine a show called Resistance will remain childish fun in the wake of the Hosnian system being destroyed and the First Order beginning to assert their dominance in the galaxy. Not to mention, if it overlaps with The Force Awakens, that means it'll basically overlap with The Last Jedi as well, since that movie picks up immediately after The Force Awakens, meaning that by the end of the first season of this new show, we could be beyond the events of both of those movies, and in a time period where the Resistance is all but wiped out, which again makes it hard to believe this show can or will remain very lighthearted. What this also means is that Season 2, which will probably start next September or October, which is a few months before Episode 9 will come out, will likely take place after the events of The Last Jedi and could even be somewhat of a prelude to Episode 9, or at least offer us some clues as to what happens to the Resistance in the wake of the events of The Last Jedi, where they have again been essentially wiped out. Which again makes me question just how childish of a show this can be in such a dark time for the galaxy. Then again, this all makes Resistance sound a lot like what Rebels was, minus the Jedi of course. Either way, I'm trying to keep an open mind about it, and we'll have a review for the first episode up sometime on Monday, I'd imagine. Well, that's all I've got for this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think. Are you excited for The Mandalorian? Are you excited for Resistance? Leave a comment below, and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.